This is WAB's Week in Review with me, Alex Helmick, and on this show, we take a look back at the week that was from your WABE news team. Well, late Friday and into early Saturday marked the end of the legislative session, Sunny Dye. For all the latest on the legislation that moved and that didn't, go to wabe.org/2025 Bill Tracker. For today's show, we start with more impact on Georgia from federal decisions in Washington, D.C. Well, more than 2,400 people at Atlanta's Centers for Disease Control and Prevention headquarters are losing their jobs. That's on top of the hundreds fired last month. The cuts are part of the Trump administration's newly announced mass firings across the U.S. Health and Human Services Department. WABE's Jess Mador reported the story.
The list of affected CDC departments is long, including reproductive health, occupational safety and health, and the National Center for Immunization and Respiratory Diseases, among others. American Federation of Government Employees Union Representative Yolanda Jacobs says she's been fielding panicked emails and calls from workers.
We knew that this was coming, but when it's actually there, it's absorbing the shots of it and figuring out ways that you can help people who have been affected.
HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had criticized the agency as inefficient in a recent video message announcing the cuts. Jess Mador, WABE News.
Public and higher education in Georgia could face changes as the White House begins dismantling the Department of Education. WAB's Julian Virgin spoke with Morehouse College's president about how this could impact his students and institution moving forward.
According to the White House, closing the Department of Education would return authority to the states and provide children and their families the opportunity to escape a system that is failing them.
There's not one state that today is equitably funding their HBCUs. Not one.
That's Morehouse President David A. Thomas, who says that's in comparison to largely white schools.
We have seen worse than this. And we've survived and we've thrived.
The Department of Education currently manages a student loan debt portfolio of more than $1.6 trillion. President Trump says the Small Business Administration, headed by former Georgia U.S. Senator Kelly Loeffler, would take over that portfolio, despite federal plans to make large cuts to that workforce as well.
The biggest barrier has always been the money.
That's Alexander Quick, a junior at Morehouse.
If he's going to do it, I hope I can graduate first.
The Department of Education also ensures that schools are abiding by federal laws surrounding discrimination. That comes as President Trump signed executive orders to dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion programs across the federal government.
Everything black is being coded as DEI, and it's all about suppressing black people.
However, Thomas says Morehouse has never been a DEI solution.
I don't care if my kids go work with white people or not. That's not what I'm training them for. I'm training them to go work and have productive lives, period.
Thomas is set to retire in June. Julian Virgin, WABE News.
Although President Donald Trump has ended refugee resettlement for now, Atlanta immigration leaders and advocates are still celebrating 45 years of welcoming refugees to the U.S. Emily Wu Pearson had more.
Georgia's own Jimmy Carter enshrined the refugee resettlement system into law when he was president.
We were not the types of people and the type of country that was going to restrict the way that people can move or to punish people for their political ideas.
That's his grandson, Jason Carter, speaking at an event celebrating almost half a century of resettlement.
What happened in 1980, the Refugee Act of 1980 passed unanimously in the United States Senate. Unanimously. This is not a partisan issue.
President Carter signed the legislation as larger numbers of people were fleeing political violence, especially in Vietnam and Cambodia after the Vietnam War. It codified the loose set of prior policies the U.S. used to let refugees in and raised the refugee cap from 17,000 to 50,000. That number has fluctuated depending on who is in office. The Biden administration set out to resettle 125,000 refugees a year. President Trump has canceled grants funding refugee resettlement and ended all contracts to refugee resettlement agencies. Padea Mixon is the CEO of New American Pathways, a refugee resettlement agency in Atlanta.
Georgia is the perfect place to celebrate the Refugee Act because not only did the only president from Georgia sign the act, but Georgia has consistently been one of the top 10 states to welcome refugees since the very beginning.
Since the act, some estimates say nearly 70,000 refugees resettled to Georgia. Emily Wu Pearson, WABE News.
Some Georgia Republican lawmakers are not on board with new tariffs from the Trump administration. The 25% tariff on auto imports now in effect. WABE's Raul Bali reported the story.
Republican State Senator Mike Hodges represents the Port of Brunswick, the top American gateway for imported and exported vehicles.
I understand the concept of tariffs, particularly as a negotiating ploy, but I am gravely concerned about any tariff action that affects the cars that are coming into the Port of Brunswick. And there are lots of jobs.
But fellow Republican State Senator Brandon Beach, who's set to become U.S. Treasurer under Trump, defends the proposal, saying it would eventually bring manufacturing fully back to the U.S.
Let's be honest, there'll be a little pain. Even the president said there'll be a little pain at first. But then we'll have a level playing field, and we'll be really taking advantage of a great economy.
Democratic State Senator Emmanuel Jones, who's also running for Congress, is an auto dealer.
Even Korean manufacturers like Hyundai, franchise that I used to own, has an assembly plant here in Georgia. But they assemble vehicles all over the world, and they actually ship those products to us.
Beach admits it will be complicated figuring out what to do about parts made outside of the U.S. when vehicles are assembled here. Raul Bali, WABE News, the state capital.
Well, legalizing online sports betting has failed once again to pass the Georgia legislature. The Peach State remains one of only a few that have not fully legalized online sports gambling. And as WABE's Marlon Hyde examined the issue, he did it during March Madness, just ahead of this weekend's big college basketball games.
Dozens of big-screen TVs and projectors simultaneously showed the overlapping NCAA tournament basketball games, which, for many, this time of year is a sports betting holiday. Whenever someone scores, among the crowd of fans, Michael Hildreth and Andrew Markey are sitting at a high-top table watching the Florida-Connecticut game, and also watching their phones.
The over-under was 150 to start the game.
In non-betting terms, Hildreth suggests they could place a wager on whether both teams' combined scores would total more than 150 points.
If it was legal here, I would probably jump on it.
But that particular bet isn't. Some forms of gambling are legal here, John.
I mean, we already have the lottery in Georgia.
That's Andrew Markey again.
That's clearly gambling, and that funded the Hope Scholarship fully when I went to college.
The Hope Scholarship pays nearly all the tuition for a state college or university. Brent Evans is a professor at Georgia College and State University who studies sports betting.
It is illegal to bet on games. So, for example, I can't bet on Georgia to win in basketball.
But fantasy sports are different, and Evans explains it is legal to some extent to bet on sports. The failed Georgia legislation would have expanded that.
And so what a lot of the legislation is about recently is trying to legalize completely online sports gambling where you can bet on really all facets of a game.
But Georgia lawmakers continue to reject that expansion. The practice has become legal in most states since the Supreme Court allowed states to decide their future with sports gambling in 2018.
It just adds a little bit of extra excitement to the game, having a personal stake in it.
Andrew Markey isn't the only one that feels that way. The American Gaming Association estimates that Americans will gamble $3.1 billion on the men's and women's basketball games. As Markey watches the game, he's also watching his phone blow up with notifications from betting apps.
It's just amazing how they try to sell those parlays. That's how they make their money. That's how I lose pretty much every bet, but it's the most fun.
Other people were talking about their bets in the bar. Some Georgians have someone they know place bets in states where it is legal. Or, like Markey, cross state lines to make plays.
Like Cherokee, North Carolina, they have a nice sports book with Michael and some other friends. We kind of take routine trips up there.
Supporters of sports betting argue the state could be losing a huge amount of money. Here's Brent Evans again, and he says that take needs a little perspective.
In Georgia, the windfall that the state would get in tax revenue, I think, is greatly overstated.
The Tax Foundation, a DC think tank and researcher, says legal sports betting in the U.S. hit more than $100 billion wagered in 2023. However, states collected just under $2 billion in tax revenue from sports betting. Evans says a primary concern is also increasing access to gambling.
So gambling addiction is absolutely a real thing. And if you make it more accessible to people, it will create some problems.
Andrew Markey says if sports betting is legalized, he would like to see whatever revenue brought in be used to help those struggling with addiction.
I think part of that money could go to therapy for people who do have gambling addictions, because once it does become legal and more mainstream, there is going to be a percentage of people who probably struggle with that.
Georgia lawmakers could still consider legalizing online sports betting in the 2026 half of Georgia's 2-year session. Marlon Hyde, WABE News.
You're listening to WAB's Week in Review with me, Alex Helmick. Well, the pollen situation in Metro Atlanta right now is brutal. A week of elevated pollen count from trees, mold, weeds. In fact, the area hit an all-time high for a daily pollen count last weekend. WAB's environment reporter Marissa Mecki had more.
Atlanta Allergy and Asthma produces the daily pollen count you see on the weather forecast every day. Even if Atlanta doesn't top its new pollen record again, Dr. David Tanner says that it's not really a single astronomical pollen count that's the sneezy, itchy culprit for seasonal allergies. It's repeated days with regularly high amounts of pollen.
But what really makes people sick is the length of time that they're actually exposed to the pollen.
Tanner says the past few weeks have been the perfect storm for trees to dump pollen. Warm, dry, with just a little wind, which likely caused Atlanta's weekend record. What comes next, though, he says, depends on the weather. He says overall, every year pollen counts are getting higher. While some scientists think that's due to climate change, he says nothing's been proven yet. But the length of the season?
What we're seeing more now than anything is the early start of the season. So we're beginning to get pollen levels in mid-February, whereas before we normally didn't start seeing pollen until the 1st of March.
For Georgians, there's still a few more weeks in the thick of it. Tanner says pollen season wraps up in mid to late April. Marissa Mecki, WABE News.
And finally today, scientists typically communicate their ideas in studies. They've got charts, they've got data. Maybe they spice things up with a fun PowerPoint. But an Atlanta group is encouraging scientists to broaden their reach by teaching them to do stand-up comedy. And WABE's Molly Samuel had the story.
You'll sort of have come to the front of the room when you know that you're next.
Lou Lefton is walking a bunch of first-time comedians through a rehearsal.
I'll be up here doing the announcement.
Lefton recently retired from Georgia Tech. He was in administration and taught mathematics. Throughout his career, he also did comedy.
Who's doing sound and maybe some.
Today, he's helping Science for Georgia, an organization based in Atlanta, teaching stand-up to people who work in science and science-related fields like medicine. They're at an Atlanta brewery. In a few days, they'll be on this stage delivering their sets to a real paying audience. This afternoon, they're getting final feedback.
Please welcome our first comedian, Liz Green.
I've been a nurse for about 25 years now. The best 25 years of my life, my profession took from me.
Scientists sometimes think they should be serious.
But Lefton says making a joke about something doesn't have to diminish it. In fact, it can help a message reach a bigger audience.
Humor is a way of opening people's minds after they laugh. They're a little bit more willing to consider new ideas, so it's valuable in teaching, it's valuable for communication.
After her set, Liz Green says that's been on her mind. Working in a hospital early in the COVID pandemic, she says she saw it firsthand as people's trust in science and medicine eroded.
You know, we were referred to as heroes in the beginning, and then now people don't trust us, they don't like us.
Science for Georgia Executive Director Amy Sharma says one of her goals is to show the human side of science.
It's really easy to lay off the CDC when you think of them as a bunch of faceless people in lab coats, but when you realize that that's your neighbor or the person that you sat next to, it becomes a new thing.
And I learned at the ripe age of 37.
One of the new comics, Tanea Albright, has a background in biological engineering.
And I'm experiencing what's called a geriatric pregnancy. How rude is that? You walk into your ultrasound expecting a cute little picture of your baby, and you walk out with an AARP membership.
Albright says she's always liked performing, and this program will help her be better at her job, too, by bringing more humor into scientific discussions.
I think a lot of times in different science communities, we keep ourselves very, formal.
And that ties into another goal. Here again is Amy Sharma, who says she wants to help scientists engage more with the rest of us.
They can't throw things over the wall. So you have to be approachable and you have to contextualize your science.
They just went and jacked up the insurance premiums. You know why? Because being a woman is a pre-existing condition.
Anita Bolani is an advisor to healthcare organizations. She says she's so serious at work, someone told her to come participate in this program.
It's just another way to reach people because, right now our political situation is very depressing.
She's worried about research grants being canceled and federal scientists losing their jobs. And Bolani says she's happy to give comedy a try. Test the hypothesis. Because as Georgia Tech mathematics grad student Daniel Huang says during his set, there's actually a fair amount of overlap between science and humor.
All we're doing as scientists and comedians is just experimenting.
Ultimately, Huang says, science and comedy are both ways of understanding the world. Molly Samuel, WABE News.
That's all for the show this week. My thanks to the WABE News team for all the great work. You can get more at WABE.org. I'm Alex Helmick. Thank you for supporting and protecting WABE and for listening to The Week in Review.